Let's be honest, you probably have a very difficult time understanding the doctrine of the Trinity. Much of the discourse about the Trinity that has taken place in online communities have basically amounted to different types of debates between Trinitarians and anti-Trinitarians. Most of it is centered around refuting specific arguments, or maybe showing that the Trinity is actually from Scripture. But this discourse is completely impoverished. And one of the areas that are most vital to understanding the Trinity never even gets spoken about. And this area is the question of what a relation is. Ever since the Arian crisis, the idea of a relation has always been invoked by the defenders of the Trinity. Yet it seems like nobody talks about what a relation is today. And for some figures, even speaking about relations are anathema. While in the past I've done videos on certain figures like St. Augustine, St. Cyril, St. Basil, and St. Boethius, and how they used relation in order to defeat the heretics of their day, and I also did a video on relation and how it proves the Trinity, I've never actually done a standalone video on relation, what relation is, and actually how relation is the key to understanding the Trinity. And I thought it was time for me to do a standalone video on relation. In order to understand what relation is, let's go all the way back to the beginning of discourse on this topic, which is found in Aristotle. Aristotle's comments on relation, which are found in Categories chapter 7, is actually one of the texts that the fathers very frequently go to when they're discussing the Trinity, whether explicitly or implicitly. The reason that this text becomes so important is because this was actually one of the few texts, along with On Interpretation, that were widely available to fathers both East and West. For example, St. Augustine writes about reading the Categories when he was a young man. Quote, "When scarce 20 years old, a book of Aristotle entitled The 10 Categories fell into my hands, on whose very name I hung as on something great and divine, when my rhetoric master of Carthage, and others who were esteemed learned, referred to it with cheeks swelling with pride. I read it alone, and understood it. And on my conferring with others, who said that with the assistance of very able masters, who not only explained it orally, but drew many things in the dust, they scarcely understood it, and could tell me no more about it than I had acquired in reading it by myself alone. And the book appeared to me to speak plainly enough of substances, such as man is, and of their qualities, such as the figure of man, of what kind it is, and his stature, how many feet high, and his relationship, whose brother he is, or where placed, or where born, or where he stands, or sits, or is shod, or armed, or does or suffers anything, and whatever innumerable things might be classed under these 9 categories, of which I've given some examples, or under the chief category of substance." End quote. In this work, Aristotle intends to lay out the 10 different categories which encompass everything that we could say about something, and therefore everything that is true. So, for example, if I say this is a dog, I'm signifying the category of substance. But there are actually many other things I could predicate of this dog, such as the dog is white, the dog is large, the dog is small, and so on and so forth. And these others constitute 9 other categories, which are commonly known as the 9 accidents. Let's say I say the dog is brown. By predicating brown to the dog, I'm predicating a certain quality. Or if I say the dog is 25 pounds, by predicating 25 pounds to the dog, I'm predicating a certain quantity, and so on and so forth. Now I could keep going on, but you get the idea. So what distinguishes this category of substance from the 9 categories of accidents? Well, substances are apt to exist in themselves, but on the other hand, accidents are apt to exist in another. So the brownness is the brownness of a dog, or the 25-poundness is the 25-poundness of a dog. These are things which exist in something else. You can't speak abstractly of brownness, except obviously as an idea in the intellect, and the same thing with a certain size like 25 pounds. When it comes to an accident is always predicated of a substance. This actually indicates that there is a twofold nature to an accident. On the one hand, there is what's called the inesse of an accident, the fact that it exists in another thing. And then there's also the ratio propria of an accident, which basically indicates the formal aspect. So what makes it an accident, which is its inesse, and then what makes it a certain type of accident, which is its ratio propria. It is important to note that these are not 2 separate parts of an accident, but rather they're two different aspects of the same accident. You can think about it like two sides of the same coin. So when we think about something like quality and we think about something like quantity, they both have an esse. They both exist in something and therefore are accidents. But on the other hand, their proper ratio are different. Let's take something like quantity. The fact that quantity exists in something else does not make it quantity. Rather, the fact that it exists in something else makes it an accident. But the very way in which it modifies substance by extending it in space, that's what makes it quantity. So that's the ratio propria of quantity. But the inesse merely makes it an accident. So here we have the twofold aspect of accident. So I told you guys that this was a video about relation. I keep yapping about substance and accident and quantity and quality and inesse and all of this stuff, but you guys just want to know about relation. So what is a relation? Well, first, relation is one of the 10 categories. Now, obviously, it's not substance, so it's one of the 9 accidents. So relation is one of the 9 categories that has an esse. Now, what distinguishes it from the others? What is its ratio propria? Well, its ratio propria is the fact that it indicates some sort of order to another. Here we're able to distinguish the twofold aspect of a relation. Insofar as it has an esse, or we usually say san, it is an accident. But insofar as it has some sort of order to another, we can say that it is relation. So when we look at other accidents like quantity, quality, action, and the like, all of these have san. This is completely correct. But none of those have esse ad, because esse ad is the ratio propria of an accident. Now, as I said before, I need to emphasize again, san and esse ad are not two different separate parts to an accident or anything like that. These are two different aspects of an accident. It's like two sides of the same coin. This is going to be extremely important later, so you guys need to remember this, okay? But in the meantime, let's make this a little bit less abstract and look at some concrete examples. A mother is the mother of a son, and a son is the son of a mother. The mother has the relationship of maternity to the son. The son has the relation of filiation to the mother. Or we could look at relations of quantity. The 50-pound dog is twice the size of the 25-pound dog, and the 25-pound dog is half the size of the 50-pound dog. Both of these are relations. Now there's something important to notice when I'm giving these examples. When it comes to both of these examples, the relation isn't between two things. Usually we think of relation as we would relationship. So when we think about a marriage, the relationship between the two is a single relationship. But this is not how the ancients thought of relation. Rather, relation exists in a certain subject towards another. So if we thought about a married couple, there would be two relations. The relation of the husband to the wife and the relation of the wife to the husband. And this would form what we would call marriage. So relation exists in one subject, not in two subjects. That's very important. But since relations are correlative, in most cases, when you have the relationship in one, you have the relationship in the other. So you can't have the husband of a wife without the wife of a husband. But it's very important to remember that this isn't one relation, this is two relations, okay? From this, we're actually able to indicate what all of the different aspects to a relation are. First, there's the subject of a relation. Obviously, since relation is an accident, relation is going to be predicated of something. So when we think about the father being the father of the son, father is the subject of the relation. Father has the relation. Remember, it's not between two, it's of one to another. Second, we have the foundation for the relation. There needs to be some sort of action which is going to establish the relation. Or in some cases, like we saw above, technically we could have quantity which establishes the relation. So the dog, which is 50 pounds and double the size of the 25-pound dog, quantity establishes this relation. But for our purposes, we're going to think about action. So when we have the father of a son, the begetting of the son is the foundation which establishes the relation of father to the son. And third, we have the terminus of the relation. So the terminus of the relation is going to be what the subject is related to. So in our example, father of the son, father is subject, begetting is action or foundation, and son is the terminus of the relation. So now that we have all of the natural philosophy stuff out of the way for thinking about what relation is, what are the different aspects of relation, what is the formal aspect, the ratio propria of relation, what are the other categories, everything like that. Now that we have all of this out of the way, we can finally look at how relation could possibly be predicated of God. The 13th century Dominican and common doctor of the Catholic Church, St. Thomas Aquinas, was able to outline this problem extremely well in his Summa Theologiae. So it's going to be that very order that I'm going to follow in the remainder of this video. Now I want to make something clear before I begin. I am not trying to demonstrate the existence of the Trinity from reason. To demonstrate the existence of the Trinity from reason is heretical. It has been condemned by the Church on numerous occasions. So I'm not trying to do that. Rather, what I am doing is, on the supposition that there is revelation, I am showing that what is revealed is coherent amongst itself. I am merely explaining what the teaching of revelation is. What is the teaching of Scripture as interpreted by the tradition and handed down by the Church? That is all that I'm doing here, okay? None of you guys should try to use what I'm about to say as a demonstrative argument for the Trinity. St. Thomas says don't do this. Catholic Church says don't do this. Now, I did a video on this, and I wrote an academia paper on this, so if you want to know more about why we can't prove the Trinity from natural reason, you can read those. But here, I am merely providing an explanation and some sort of natural congruence for the teaching on the Trinity. Now let's get back to seeing how relation can be predicated of God. Because as we went over above, there are three aspects to a relation. There is the subject, there's the terminus, and there's the foundation. So obviously, if we wanted to discuss the persons, and the persons are based on the relations, we're going to want to start out with the foundation. So we're going to start with foundation, and then we're going to go to relation, and then we're going to go to persons. And this is exactly what St. Thomas does. In question 27, he looks at the foundation, and the foundation is some sort of act, which is procession. Question 28, he looks at real relations. And in question 29 and following, he looks at personhood. This is very important. Starting with the foundation, as we covered above, there are two possible foundations for a real relation. On the one hand, it can be quantity, and on the other hand, it can be a certain action. Now, we know that God obviously does not have quantity, because quantity is necessarily going to be in reference to some sort of extension, and obviously God isn't somehow extended. Further, quantity follows upon the material aspect of something, and there is no material aspect to God. So obviously, we're not going to be able to found relation on that. But can we found it on action? So in order to consider whether it can be found on action, we need to look at the two types of action that an agent can have. On the one hand, action can be transient. Transient action is action that goes outside of the agent. So for example, if I pick up a ball and throw it, that is transient action. Now obviously, transient action cannot be what we're looking for, because nothing that is outside of God can be God. That would be ridiculous. But on the other hand, we can actually look at immanent action. So immanent action is action that happens within the agent, and its terminus does not pass outside of the agent. So for example, thinking and willing. When I think and I will, and I keep it within myself, that is an immanent action. So possibly, when we're thinking about a relation in God, if there were such a relation, we should be looking not at quantity, that's impossible, not at transient action, that's impossible, but only at immanent action. We've considered all of the possibilities, so the only one left is going to be immanent action. Now we're able to narrow the question down a lot. Rather than simply asking, is there a relation in God, or is there some sort of foundation for relation, we're able to ask the particular question, is there something in God which could provide the foundation for relation in being an immanent act? Now, does God have immanent acts? It's a great question. Well, God has two faculties which are capable for immanent acts. God has an intellect and God has a will. So he has these two faculties which are able to produce its termini, or its product, if you want to put it like that, inside the agent rather than outside of the agent. So we can ask the question, does the intellect and does the will produce such a thing? Now, when it comes to these actions, we actually see something very interesting. When we consider intellects, we see that intellects are very fruitful. intellects actually, in understanding something, produce a concept, or we sometimes call it an interior word. So, for example, if I'm looking at a cup and I'm considering cupness, a little cup is produced by my intellect so I can know the cup through that thing. This is called an intentional image or concept or word. Any one of those ideas can be used to describe this. But whatever it is, we know that our intellect is fruitful. Our intellect produces things within us. Now, we can actually go even further than this. When we consider not something outside of us, but we consider our very selves, we actually produce an intentional image of ourself within us. We produce a concept or word of ourself within us. We actually produce a little accidental self within our intellects. Yet, as I said, this is accidental. My intellect is imperfect. My intellect is limited. So anything that my intellect produces is merely going to be an image or shadow of the reality. It's obviously not going to be the reality itself. I can't just think of a cup and then produce a real cup in my intellect. It's not how it works. But things work slightly differently when we consider God. God doesn't need to produce these concepts in his intellect in order to understand things. God, in his eminence, in his perfection, contains all things within himself in a more perfect mode by the perfection of the divinity. So God merely needs to gaze at himself, and in knowing himself, he can know all things. But we ask that second question. Just like I can know the cup and produce the intentional image of the cup in my intellect, and further, I can know myself and produce the intentional image of myself in the intellect. I can produce a little me in the intellect. What would happen if God, rather than simply considering created things in his own divinity, he actually considered himself? Could there be a fruitful production of a word? Could there be this fruitful production of a concept? Could there be this infinite communication, not merely of intentional being, not merely of a word like in my intellect, not merely of a shadow and image of the reality, but God in his perfection, rather than being limited like my intellect is, could, in the consideration of himself, he actually communicate his divinity? This communication wouldn't be like my intellect. My intellect, when I consider myself, it's something limited. It's something accidental, something fleeting. This is the divine intellect. The divine intellect would not produce something accidental, shadowy, fleeing, or anything like that. It wouldn't merely communicate intentional being. It would communicate the entirety of the deity. It would produce a word that is not merely a representation of God. It would produce a word that is God. This, according to Christian theology, is the foundation for the relation. This is the action that forms that foundation of the Father to the Word, and of the Word to the Father. For those who don't know, Word is another name for God the Son. Yet, there's not only one faculty in God. God does not only have an intellect. God also has a will. And this will, as in us, produces love. So if we go through the same process to where we consider something and we have this impulse of love within us, and we consider this on the part of God, there would be, just as there is a word, there would also be a spirit. And this is what we refer to as the Holy Spirit. So these two are the two actions that we found the divine relations on. Yet, does this stay a mere action within God? Or does this actually produce a relationship between a subject and its terminus? It would seem, of course, quite fitting that we think of this as actually producing some sort of terminus, as actually including the production of a word and the production of a spirit. But there are obviously some difficulties at hand. It seems absolutely and utterly possible. It actually might even seem absurd that we have this communication of the divinity, this entire incomplete communication of the divinity, and it result in real distinction. We look at certain created examples, for example, a father who has the action of begetting, which founds the relationship with a son. It's very easy to think of these two as having relations one to the other. Why? Well, because they're really distinct. This one is really distinct by its matter, and that one's really distinct by its matter. They both have human nature, but they have two different individualizations or particularizations of human nature. So it's very easy for us to think about relations one to another. But in God, we don't have this material distinction or numerical distinction between two divinities. Rather, we have the one, same, simple, united divinity. So how can we even speak of these two as distinct one to the other? It makes no sense. How can we even speak of this relation? The solution to this problem is actually quite simple, and it relies on what we discussed before concerning relation. Because if you remember, there are two aspects to relation. There's the esse in of relation, and there's the esse ad of relation. The esse ad is what forms the proper ratio of relation. So, in order for there to be a relation, there simply needs to be this order to another. While every accident has this twofold aspect of the esse in the proper ratio, relation is unique. Because when we look at all of the accidents besides relation, not only does imperfection enter into its esse in, but imperfection enters into its proper ratio. So let's take, for example, quantity. Quantity involves the idea of materiality, as we went over above. Or if we think about quality, quality is going to somehow change the subject. But relation's unique. Why is relation unique? Well, relation doesn't somehow modify the subject. Rather, relation involves simply an order to another. So, when it comes to all of the other accidents are merely metaphorically applied to God. But when it comes to relation, while relation isn't predicated as an accident, still its proper ratio can be retained. So if we're able to show some sort of foundation, such as the immanent acts above, then it's perfectly rational to retain the esse ad of the relation, and therefore its proper ratio. This is why, for the fathers, there were only two proper predicates of God. Either terms were absolute, or terms were relative. Anything else was somehow metaphorical, or not said to be in God. This is all going to become very, very important in 1 second, and we're going to completely resolve the objection. But first, in order for clarity's sake, let's go over what the first procession is, and how the first procession has these two relations. The first procession that we went over is the procession of intellect. What does the procession of intellect involve? Because as we went over before, unlike our modern use of the term relationship, for these actions found two relations. The relation of the subject to its terminus, and then we can think of the terminus being related to the subject. So when it comes to this action, which is intellectual generation, we're going to have the relation of paternity, which is the relation of the Father to the Word, and the relationship of filiation, which is the relation of the Word to the Father. These are going to be the two relations which are brought forward. But there's a difficulty. Because we said that there's numerically one divinity, how can the Father and the Word be the self-same God, be the self-same divinity, have numerically the same attributes, one holiness, one goodness, one love, and so on and so forth? How can we predicate this? Well, it comes down to what we said above. There is a twofold aspect to relation, the esse in and the esse ad. We say that the Father and the Son share the same esse in, which is going to cover things like existence, love, goodness, divinity, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we say that they are distinct in their esse ad. This is where we're going to hit our intellectual limits, because there never has been, nor will there ever be, an argument that this is impossible. There is no argument which can conclude that this is impossible. The esse in of two relations can be the same. So the divinity can be the same. And all that distinguishes these two are going to be by the esse ad. There's no argument which can disprove this. We've tried. We've answered every objection that there is. There is no argument against this. Now, the issue that many of you are going to have is it's really hard to wrap your head around. It's actually impossible to wrap your head around this. You can't imagine it because you're so used to thinking in material and individual ways. It's very hard to abstract. But what you need to do is you can't follow your emotions or your feelings or your first impressions about something. You have to do the hard intellectual work. If you cannot see a contradiction, then you cannot somehow exclude this necessarily. So, what is the contradiction, guys? What is the so-called impossibility for these two relations to have distinct esse ad, but to share the same esse in? Where's the argument? We've been trying for a very long time to give good arguments against our own positions. It's actually what scholasticism is famous for. But we've never been able to give an argument showing that this is impossible. The fact that you can't wrap your mind around it, or the fact that you can't visualize it, does not mean that it's somehow untrue. Rather, we need to be men. We need to think with our minds, think with our intellects. We need to determine things on the basis of argumentation, not on the basis of feelings, and not on the basis of whether you can imagine something in your minds. Rather, we can declare with confidence that there is no contradiction when it comes to this declaration of Catholic theology. So, this is going to be the peak right here of this entire video, is that this distinction when it comes to relation, the nature of relation in general, is going to vindicate what we claim about the unity and the distinction of the persons. As we went over above, relation is special. It does not somehow modify a subject. Rather, it indicates the order of a subject to its terminus. This is why we're allowed to say relative things of God in a proper way. On the other hand, when it comes to the other accidents, they don't simply modify its order, but they modify the subject itself. And therefore, this would be somehow repugnant to the divine simplicity and perfection. So, as weird as it sounds that the subject and the terminus of a relation have the same esse in, it is actually not impossible. And there never has been, and there never will be an argument to show that this is impossible. We need to be careful to remember that we ought not to follow our own limitations in our imagination or our passions or our prejudices when we do this type of theology. This type of theology is hard, it's difficult, it's abstract, it takes a lot of mental toil. So we ought not to follow these passions or prejudices, or they will always lead us down a bad path. Rather, we need to purely follow where reason and revelation lead us. And when you follow reason, you see that there is no possible way to say that what we declare about relation, its twofold aspect, and its relation to the one single, simple divinity is impossible. We see that there is no way, and there never has been an argument which declares this to be impossible. This same, of course, is going to apply to the second procession. The second procession, which we call the procession of volition, or the procession of love. So we're going to have the Father and the Son as the subject of active spiration, and the Holy Spirit as the terminus. And when it comes to passive spiration, the Spirit is going to be the subject, and the Father and the Son are going to be the terminus of this relation. And of course, the relation on both sides has its foundation in the action, which is the action of spiration. Finally, we can invoke something called relative opposition. When it comes to any relation that we could ever give, there's going to be a real distinction between the subject and the terminus, if it is a real relation. So, by positing a real relation with a real foundation, we are necessarily going to posit a real distinction. So, when it comes to the procession of the Word and the procession of the Spirit, one which flows upon intellection and the other which flows upon distinction, so when we look at the two processions, we're going to see that if there is a real act which is present, a real act of intellection or a real act of volition, and these truly produce termini, the one produces the Word and the other produces the Spirit, and from this there is a real relation, we're going to see that this real relation is necessarily going to lead to relative opposition. And when you have this relative opposition, which is the lack of identity between the subject and the terminus of a relation, then necessarily we're going to posit real distinction. Real distinction between the subject and the terminus. Therefore, we can say that the Father is really distinct from the Son, and the Father and the Son are really distinct from the Spirit. And this happens by way of relative opposition. And this actually clarifies something for us. Because a lot of you might be thinking, well, there's two processions. So from these two processions, there must be four persons. Since, as I said above, when it comes to each one of these acts, there's going to be relations on either side. But what we see is that when it comes to active spiration, the active spiration that is present in the Father and the Son, there is no relative opposition between paternity and active spiration. There is no relative opposition between filiation and active spiration. Therefore, paternity and active spiration and filiation and active spiration can exist in the same subject. In the same way that you might have a teacher who teaches two students and therefore has these two relations, yet it's not like he somehow doubles his teaching. He only has one teaching. In a similar way, we can think about how intellection and volition produce really distinct termini. Because it would seem that since intellect and will are not really distinct in God due to divine simplicity, that therefore they could not produce really distinct termini. Now, this would actually be true if there was no relative opposition. If there was no relative opposition between the terminus of intellection and the terminus of volition, they would collapse into one. Now, what does this prove? Well, this proves that the terminus of intellection, that is the Son or the Word, somehow is also the subject of active spiration. Because unless this was the case, there would be no relative opposition between the Word and the Spirit. It's only by this relative opposition that you're able to distinguish the termini of both processions. And therefore, this proves the Latin teaching on the filioque. But I did another video on this argument in particular, so I would encourage, if you want to know more about that, to watch that video. Thus far, we've established quite a few things. Let's go over them before we move on. First, we have established that a relation is one of the categories. Second, we have established that relation has two aspects, esse in and esse ad, the latter of which is the proper ratio of a relation. Third, we have established that, due to the nature of esse ad, that, unlike the other categories, relation can be properly predicated of God. Fourth, we have established that there are three aspects of relation, subject, foundation, and terminus. Fifth, we have established that the only foundation for a relation that could be predicated to God is action. Sixth, we have established that there are two faculties that can act in such a way, intellect and will. Seventh, we have established that each of these processions will result in two relations. Thus, there are four in God: paternity, filiation, active spiration, and quasi-passive spiration. Eighth, we have established that there is nothing contrary for these four relations mentioned above to share the same esse in, but to be distinct as to esse ad, which properly constitutes relation. Ninth, we have established that real relation necessarily leads us to concede real distinction. But what else is there left for us to demonstrate? It seems that we've went over everything. Well, we actually just still need to demonstrate that the subject and the terminus of each one of these relations is going to be a person. There's actually very much confusion on what it means to be a person. What does it mean when we say that the Trinity is one nature, three persons? What does this word person mean? Some heretics, like William Lane Craig or others, would like to pretend that person somehow indicates some sort of self-mastery of intellect and will. And therefore, when he posits three persons, he's going to posit three intellects, three wills. He's going to posit three everything when it comes to the Trinity, and then kind of post hoc still claim that there is one God.
As I say, the biblical data teach that there are exactly three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are properly called God. And so those of us who are social Trinitarians take this very seriously and literally, that there are three centers of self-consciousness.
Pain. Pain to my Latin soul. My Latin blood courses hot through my veins. Pain. It's pain. It's such pain. Centers of consciousness. Who came up with that nonsense? Who came up with it? Who came up with that nonsense? In essence, anything that holds to threeness in God, besides the threeness of relation, is going to somehow multiply the esse in. And if you multiply the esse in, you're going to multiply not what's relative in God, and therefore multiply the persons, but you're going to multiply what is absolute in God, and therefore multiply the divinity. So any other multiplication besides relation is going to lead to multiple gods. It's going to lead to very bad things. So, how are we defining personhood? Well, when the ancients defined personhood, rather than thinking about something as to personal dignity, or something as to personal awareness, or something as to individually possessing an intellect or individually possessing a will, rather than thinking about something like that, they thought of something very different. The intention of the ancients, when considering personhood, was to consider how there is an individual iteration of something. So if we think about something like humanity, humanity is going to refer to the universal. It's going to refer to the communicable. Humanity is abstract. So humanity is communicable to multiple different individuals. There could be multiple different individuals that are contained in the category of humanity. But when it comes to Peter or Paul or Thomas or whoever, these individual iterations are incommunicable. So we see that the foundation isn't necessarily that there is some sort of individual iteration, numerically individual iteration of humanity in Peter, or a numerically individual iteration of humanity in Paul. These are merely accidental to whether there is actually a person or not. Rather, what's important is whether there is communicability. So, when it comes to the Trinity, are the subject and the terminus, by the real relation they have with one another, is this communicable or is it incommunicable? Could paternity be communicated? No, of course not. Could filiation be communicated? Of course not. Could passive spiration be communicated? Of course not. So because these can't be communicated, then by definition, because we have an incommunicable possession, we have personhood. Because we're talking about something which is intellectual and not merely a rock or a stick or a stone, we actually do have personhood in this case. Thus, definitionally, if you're going to concede processions, you need to concede relations. And if you're going to concede relations, you're going to need to concede relative opposition. And if you're going to concede relative opposition, you're going to concede real distinction. And if you concede real distinction, you're going to concede persons. So we have completely and utterly verified the teaching of the Catholic Church. There are 4 relations. The 4 relations are paternity, filiation, active spiration, passive spiration. There are 3 persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And there are 2 processions, the procession of intellection and the procession of volition. And we hold all of this, but we also hold that there is one God. And we are able to do this by the key which unlocks everything else, which is relation. But that's all that I have for you guys. As always, God bless.